Colosseum literally means a great or a huge or a massive amphitheater, okay? Now, the Colosseum is by far the largest amphitheater in the Roman Empire. So let me give you some facts. So the size of this place, 620 feet by 513, if that means anything to you, or in metric, 190 by 155 meters. Gives you an idea of the size. With seating for approximately 50,000 spectators. So can you imagine this place full? What the noise would have been like, the roar of the crowds and everything else, just huge, 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 wouldn't it? I find it fascinating, and this really is an insight into Roman culture. The Romans were very, very advanced in many ways. Okay, we've seen some of the architecture, the building blocks and everything else. The Roman army was the most advanced military of its time as well, which is why it was able to conquer in the way it conquered. But entertainment-wise, one of the most popular things in Roman culture in terms of entertainment was to spend the day eating, drinking, relaxing in somewhere like this, watching people ripped limb from limb by either wild animals or gladiators. That was entertainment. And that of itself should tell us something about this massively advanced and yet incredibly brutal culture. Okay. Often amphitheatres are dug into hillsides or used other geography as a means of support. So a lot of the places you'll see them around the world, you'll see them actually using the geography of the landscape in order to be able to build them. But this one is freestanding, which of itself, not just the size of it, but the way it was constructed was architectural, statement of its time. Made of stone and concrete. I've already mentioned to you about the 3 stories of arches which are clearly visible on the outside, the Doric, the Ionic, and then the Corinthian. So hopefully you've all been able to see those, and there were some examples as we came down the steps again, particularly of the Corinthian tops of the columns. This place work began in this place 72 AD. Okay, so put that into context with you when we acknowledge that the temple in Jerusalem was sacked in 70 AD. It was leveled and looted, and the work on this place begun under Emperor Vespasian, okay, and it was funded with the spoils from the temple in Jerusalem. So all the gold and the riches and everything else that was taken from that was used to pay for this to be built. When you consider what took place within it, that puts it in a slightly different light. It was built by primarily Jewish slaves that were taken captive in Judea and brought in transports here to be used as slaves. So they were literally, the temple was robbed, the money and then the people were used to build this, and then they were fed into the middle and killed. It took about 8 years for completion of the place. So it was completed in 80 AD, so 72 to 80 AD is the construction, completed by Titus, who was Vespasian's son. Okay, and we'll see that the Arch of Titus after this. When it was opened with 100 days of games. 100 consecutive days of games. And games included gladiatorial matches, so warriors literally going toe-to-toe in armed combat, and that was to the death. None of this, sort of tap out or anything like that. It was to the death. Wild animal fights, and sometimes even larger combats, so armies against armies. It's reported also that the place was flooded for mock naval battles as well. But bear in mind, there's nothing mock about these things. People were still dying in the arena because that's what they wanted to see. The more bloody, the more gruesome it was, the more people were entertained. What I find interesting as well is that there was no Discovery Channel, no Sky TV, no Google back then. So often when you saw a wild animal in this place, it was the first time you'd ever laid eyes on an animal like that. The first time seeing a lion maybe, or a bear, or some other exotic creature from around and about. The place was used for 4 centuries before it eventually fell into neglect. And it was actually, what a lot of the decay we see is because building materials were taken from this to be used in other parts of the city. And it remained in neglect until the 18th century. Gladiators were generally slaves or prisoners of war or condemned criminals. But their lives were considered of no value. The only value attached to their lives was the amount of money that the owners of those slaves or gladiators could make from the entertainment that they created. Now, this obviously goes some way to explaining the culture, okay? But I want you to consider, just for a second, some of the scriptures in the book of Romans in light of what took place here, okay? So Jewish slaves, Christian slaves, all fed to either wild animals or killed at the hand of gladiators. And can you imagine the scenario? So what we've got down here is a bunch of, tunnels, as was. They would have been topped, so there would have been a floor on top of there, and underneath there were cells, tunnels, and all the rest of it where slaves were kept, gladiators were kept, wild animals were kept, until eventually they were released into the auditorium. And you've got this massive, deafening din of people. Okay, can you imagine being one of those slaves under there? The fear, knowing, and then when eventually you come out here, you've got 50,000 people cheering as you are ripped limb from limb. They take pleasure in your death. And sometimes the pleasure is in you being ripped limb from a creature that you've never even seen before. This is the thing, as far as you're concerned, out of mythology. You know, things that you've never even seen before. And what would you associate this creature that's literally devouring you? You probably relate it to sort of demonic maybe, or all sorts of things. Because we often fear the unknown as well, don't we? So it's doubly so in this sort of environment. Romans 8. Paul is writing to the congregation in Rome. He's never been there, but he's writing to the congregation. We too quickly take some of these scriptures for ourselves, okay? Romans 8, verse 18. For I consider the sufferings of this present time not worthy to be compared with the glory that is to be revealed to us. What sufferings was he talking about? He wasn't talking about our issues in relationships. He wasn't talking about our money problems or, you know, what's going to happen on the soap opera next week. Those are not the issues he's talking about. This is the sufferings that they're facing. Now, when Paul wrote, I just want to make a point, the Colosseum was not yet built. Okay, so we're not talking about this specific Colosseum, but like I said, there were many amphitheaters throughout the Roman Empire where Jews and Christian slaves were being fed to. This was what they were facing. Romans 8, verse 26, in the same way, the Spirit helps in our weakness. For we do not know how to pray as we should, but the Spirit himself intercedes for us with groans too deep for words. Imagine in that fearful moment, facing things you've never even seen before, you can't even comprehend. Words fail. The fear and everything else in those moments, how do I pray in that moment, just not knowing what I'm facing? The groans deep within our heart, deep within our soul. Only God knows, only the Spirit in those moments even, groans uttered too deep for words. There's a real picture for me of not just the concept of speaking in tongues, which often we relate things like this to, but the concept of just in that moment of there's nothing else in me. And just out of the bottom of our spirit, what's coming out in those moments. Verse 35. Who shall separate us from the love of Christ, or the love of Messiah? Shall tribulation, or distress, or persecution, or famine, they were likely half-starved, or nakedness, because they'd have been sent out with very little clothing, if any at all, or danger, or sword? Paul's writing to these guys saying, I get what you're facing. None of these things are bigger than God. None of these things can separate you from the love of the Messiah. Verse 36, as it is written, for your sake we are being put to death all day long. We are counted as sheep for the slaughter. That's literally what they were counted as. Your life is nothing other than you're going to be slaughtered. Verse 37, but in all these things, we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. For I am convinced that neither death nor life, nor angels, nor principalities, nor the emperor, nor the mighty Roman Empire, nor these and any of these things, nor things present, nor things to come, nor height, nor depth, nor any other created thing. Like I said, imagine you've never seen a lion before and you're just faced with this incredible, terrifying beast for the first time. Any other created thing will be able to separate us from the love of God that is in Yeshua, the Messiah, our Lord. I just find it fascinating when you see what went on here, and just to read that. It's such a common passage for us all, and it's not that we can't absolutely apply it to our lives today, but the persecutions, the trials, the tribulations faced back then, what we face really pales into insignificance by comparison, doesn't it? And like I said, the fact that the Romans took such great pleasure in that entertainment goes away to explaining an aspect of the culture, and also how much they valued or didn't value many Christians and Jews in those situations.